when multiple social policies are implemented alongside each other, do they always complement each other, or are they always also sometimes in competition? For example, over political support, over scarce resources, over ideology. And what does this then imply for the effectiveness of these policies for the well-being of the recipients who are receiving it? Based on my research, I'm finding that in terms of pro-poor policies in Malawi and Zambia, this policy competition is actually undermining its effectiveness. In Malawi and Zambia, social policy expansion often comes down to a domestic elite who is relatively socially conservative, and to a number of international well-funded donors who often have diverse interests and diverse ideologies when it comes to social policy. In such a situation, you often find that policy competition is actually quite high, and that the expansion of social policy can be slow, limited, and erratic. Now, I spent 6 months in Malawi and Zambia interviewing politicians, elected officials, civil servants, trying to understand how two major policies interact with each other. The first one being agricultural input subsidies. These are usually fertilizer and seed that are delivered to small-scale farmers, usually before growing season once a year, at below market prices. And the second is social cash transfers. These are periodic dispensations of small amounts of money to people who are considered the most vulnerable and the most poor in both countries, usually monthly. So then, do these two policies complement each other and compete? Of course, it's a very complex answer, but let me give you a little taster of my findings. So on the level of ideology, you often find that domestic elites prefer these subsidies over cash transfers because they feel that subsidies support this idea of self-sufficiency of the farmer, whilst the cash transfers are quote-unquote free money, which only just enhance people's dependence on state support. Donors, on the other hand, have an opposite view. They often feel these cash transfers amplify people's choices on what they can spend it on, and they feel these subsidies are usually inefficient and quite expensive. So then who wins? That is, of course, dependent on their power, the policy-making power, and that shifts over time. So recently, for example, we found that the cash transfers have really made headway because of a recent monetary crisis happening in both countries, which has led both governments to have to borrow from the IMF, and the IMF in turn has used this financial leverage to demand the expansion of cash transfers and the reduction or even limitation of the subsidies. So can this be sustained? Well, in Malawi, it looks like it might not be sustained because the domestic interest is very much not in favor of this policy shift. In Zambia, there's more interest, but there's still big question marks. So this is just a very small piece of my findings, but I want to give you a few takeaway messages nonetheless. So first of all, you cannot really understand the politics of one of these policies without understanding the other. Secondly, domestic interests are usually very important when it comes to the sustainability of these policies and should be taken into account. And thirdly, we're talking about recipients who often suffer food crises, or at least the risk of food crisis, every year. And this policy competition creates a very erratic policy environment. And I would argue that the predictability of policies is a good in and of itself. So, thank you.